In the year 79, Mount Vesuvius buried an entire Roman town under a wave of instantly carbonized everything it touched, including an entire private library of scrolls sitting inside a luxury villa. For nearly 2,000 years, those scrolls sat sealed shut, blackened, brittle, and completely unreadable because the moment anyone tried to physically unroll one, it crumbled into dust. Then, using nothing but X-ray scans and artificial intelligence, scientists finally found a way to read the words trapped inside without ever opening them. And the very first clearly translated word to emerge from inside one of these silent, sealed scrolls, after 2,000 years of complete darkness, was the ancient Greek word for disgust. Stick with me for the next few minutes, because what AI has managed to pull out of these scrolls is genuinely one of the most remarkable feats of modern technology, and the deeper implication behind it, just how much of human history has already been lost forever, and how little time we actually have to save what remains, is honestly the part that should unsettle you most. To understand why this discovery matters so much, you first need to understand exactly what was buried, and exactly how badly it was destroyed. The Villa of the Papyri sat just outside the ancient Roman town of Herculaneum, a wealthy seaside community, located roughly 10 miles north of the far more famous city of Pompeii. When Vesuvius erupted in the year 79, it did not simply rain ash down from the sky the way most people imagine. It unleashed a series of pyroclastic surges, superheated clouds of gas and ash moving at incredible speed and reaching temperatures well over 400 degrees Fahrenheit. That intense, sudden heat did something strange and, as it turns out, oddly fortunate to the scrolls stored inside the villa's library. Instead of simply burning them to ash the way you might expect, it carbonized them almost instantly, essentially turning delicate papyrus into something closer to fragile, blackened charcoal, before a subsequent flow of mud and debris sealed everything underneath more than 60 feet of solid volcanic material. That combination of extreme heat and rapid burial turned out to be an accidental blessing in disguise. The scrolls were, in a strange way, protected from the kind of gradual decay that destroys organic material exposed to open air and oxygen over centuries. When the Villa of the Papyri was rediscovered by excavators in 1750, workers uncovered hundreds of these blackened, tightly rolled scrolls, and it quickly became one of the most tantalizing archaeological discoveries in history, an entire ancient library, the only one to survive intact from the classical world, sitting right there, physically present, and almost completely unreadable. For the better part of the next 250 years, scholars tried absolutely everything they could think of to get inside these scrolls. Early efforts in the 18th century were often genuinely destructive. One Roman artist named Camillo Paderni reportedly tried slicing scrolls in half just to peer inside and copy down whatever fragments of visible text he could make out before the material crumbled apart entirely. A Vatican priest named Antonio Piaggio later invented a slow, painstaking mechanical device specifically designed to gently unroll the scrolls a fraction of an inch at a time. An improvement, certainly, but still a process that frequently destroyed significant portions of text in the process. Later, researchers tried injecting the scrolls with mercury, coating them in various chemical solvents, and testing methods, each attempt yielding a small amount of legible text, while simultaneously damaging or completely destroying the rest of the scroll being tested. By the 20th century, the scientific consensus had essentially settled into a resigned acceptance. The vast majority of these scrolls, several hundred of them still sitting rolled up in storage at libraries in Naples and Paris, would almost certainly never be read. Physically unrolling them was simply too destructive, and the material was too fragile to survive the process. That grim assumption held firm for decades, right up until a computer scientist named Brent Seals, working at the University of Kentucky, began exploring an entirely different approach. Rather than physically touching the scrolls at all, Seals and his collaborators proposed scanning them using highly advanced X-ray imaging technology, capturing an extraordinarily detailed three-dimensional digital model of each scroll's internal structure without ever unrolling a single layer. In theory, if the scan was detailed enough, you could digitally identify and separate each individual wound layer of papyrus, essentially unrolling the scroll virtually inside a computer, while the actual physical object remained completely undisturbed and intact. If discoveries like this genuinely fascinate you, go ahead and hit that like button. It really helps get this kind of story in front of more curious people. There was, however, an enormous problem standing directly in the way of that plan. The ink ancient scribes used to write on these particular scrolls was made primarily from carbon, essentially a form of soot mixed with water, and a binding agent. Once the papyrus itself became carbonized by the volcanic heat, both the ink and the material it was written on turned essentially the exact same shade of black. An X-ray scan could successfully capture the physical structure and layering of the papyrus in incredible detail, but it could not, on its own, actually distinguished the carbon-based ink from the carbonized papyrus surrounding it, you could see the scroll's shape perfectly. You simply could not see any of the actual writing. This is exactly where artificial intelligence entered the picture, and it is worth understanding specifically what the AI involved was actually doing, because it is genuinely more subtle and clever than simply pointing a computer at an image and asking it to read the words. Researchers eventually discovered that ancient ink, even when it shared an identical color with the surrounding papyrus, left behind an incredibly subtle physical texture difference on the surface where it had been applied, a faint pattern of tiny raised or cracked ridges that scientists began referring to as crackle. This crackle pattern was virtually invisible to the human eye, and even difficult for standard image processing techniques to reliably detect, but it turned out to be exactly the kind of extremely subtle, complex pattern that a properly trained machine learning model excels at picking out from enormous amounts of scan data. To make this technology openly available, and to accelerate progress, Seals and his team, along with support from several Silicon Valley, known as the Vesuvius Challenge, a global competition offering more than $1 million in total prize money to any individual or team who could successfully develop machine learning tools capable of reading meaningful, substantial passages of text from these scanned scrolls. The competition drew in an enormous, genuinely unlikely mix of participants, professional computer scientists, but also enthusiastic hobbyists, university students, and self-taught programmers scattered across the entire world, all working collaboratively and competitively to refine and improve the underlying detection algorithms. The breakthrough moment arrived in October of 2023, when a 22-year-old undergraduate student from Nebraska named Luke Ferrator became the very first person in documented history to successfully read an entire complete word from deep inside a still-sealed Herculaneum scroll. The word he was found, glowing faintly against the digital reconstruction of the ancient papyrus, was the ancient Greek word for the color purple. It was a genuinely small discovery in terms of raw content, a single word describing a color, but its significance was enormous. It proved conclusively, and for the very first time in over 2 centuries of failed attempts, that reading these scrolls without ever physically opening them was actually genuinely possible. From that pivotal moment forward, progress accelerated dramatically. By February of 2024, a team consisting of Ferrator alongside 2 other competitors, Youssef Nader and Julian Schilliger, had successfully extracted more than 2,000 legible characters of continuous ancient Greek text from within a single scroll, enough connected material for professional papyrologists to finally begin real, substantive translation work. What they found was a previously completely unknown philosophical work, almost certainly written by an Epicurean philosopher named Philodemus, discussing the nature of pleasure, arguing, among other things, that scarcity does not automatically make something more pleasurable than abundance, and directly criticizing rival philosophical schools for phalant, simply a random fragment. It was a coherent G to properly define pleasure at all. This was no previously unread argument from an actual ancient philosopher, emerging into readable existence for the very first time in nearly 2,000 years. If you enjoy this kind of careful, well-researched dive into archaeology and technology, consider subscribing, since there's a lot more of this kind of content coming. The pace of discovery has continued accelerating well beyond that initial breakthrough. In February of 2025, researchers working with a different scroll, cataloged as PFERC 172, successfully extracted another word from deep within its still-sealed carbonized layers. That word was diatropy, the ancient Greek term for disgust, and researchers noted it appeared to show up at least twice within the portion of text they had managed to recover so far. There is something genuinely eerie about that particular detail, worth sitting with for a moment. An anonymous author, writing roughly 2,000 years ago, put down a word expressing revulsion or disgust about something, some idea, some person, some experience we still do not fully understand the context of, and that specific human emotion, preserved perfectly inside carbonized ash for 2 millennia, was the very first thing modern technology managed to recover from that particular scroll. By May of 2025, researchers achieved another genuinely remarkable milestone, successfully recovering the actual title and author attribution from inside a still completely sealed, unopened scroll for the very first time in the project's history. The recovered title read simply, On Vices, attributed once again to Philodemus, being able to identify precisely what a still-rolled, sealed scroll actually contains before ever needing to read a single column of its main body represents an enormous practical advantage for researchers managing hundreds of remaining scrolls, allowing them to prioritize which specific scrolls are likely to contain the most valuable or previously unknown material. Then, in June of 2026, the project reached what researchers themselves have described as a genuinely historic milestone. Using an even more advanced imaging instrument, a high-resolution phase, contrast X-ray microtomography system located at the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility in Grenoble, France, researchers successfully read an entire Herculaneum scroll from beginning to end, completely for the very first time in the project's history, without the scroll ever being physically opened at any point in the process. The scroll, catalogued as Ferc 1667, had remained sealed shut since the moment Vesuvius erupted in the year 79. Researchers announced the achievement standing at the Biblioteca Nazionale di Napoli, with Mount Vesuvius itself visible rising in the distance behind them, a genuinely striking, almost poetic setting for revealing a text the very same volcano had silenced nearly 2,000 years earlier. In a separate scroll examined during that same announcement, researchers also successfully recovered, identifying the work as Philodemus on Gods, Book 8, a discovery that itself proved significant, since scholars previously only knew of a single book belonging to that particular philosophical work. Finding evidence of an eighth book instantly expanded historians' understanding of just how extensive that particular treatise on the gods originally was. It is worth pausing here to genuinely appreciate the scale of what still remains unread, because this is exactly where the more unsettling side of this story comes into focus. Roughly 1,800 scrolls were papyri back in the 1750s. Only a relatively small fraction of those have been successfully read so far, even with all of this remarkable technological progress. And there is compelling archaeological evidence suggesting the excavated portion of the villa itself represents only a fraction of the entire original structure, meaning there is a very real, seriously considered possibility that an even larger, still completely unexcavated section of that same ancient library remains buried underground at the site to this very day, sealed beneath volcanic rock that has never been touched by any archaeologist. Sit with that idea for a moment, because it is genuinely staggering once it fully sinks in. This is not simply a story about impressive new scanning technology, though it certainly is that too. It is a stark, concrete reminder of exactly how fragile and how easily lost the accumulated knowledge, philosophy, and literature of entire human civilizations can actually be. The scrolls we are now finally able to read were, quite literally, seconds away from complete and total obliteration, saved from outright incineration purely by an accident of extreme heat and rapid burial that happened to carbonize rather than fully destroy them. Countless other ancient texts throughout human history were not nearly so fortunate. The Library of Alexandria, one of the greatest repositories of ancient knowledge ever assembled, was gradually lost through a combination of fires, neglect, several centuries, and the overwhelming majority of the works it once contained are gone forever, known to us today only through second-hand references made by other ancient authors describing works they had personally read but that no longer physically exist anywhere on Earth. That is genuinely the most unsettling part of this entire story, the part that lingers well after the initial excitement of a newly translated ancient Greek word fades away. We are only now, through an extraordinarily fortunate combination of volcanic accident and cutting-edge modern technology, beginning to recover a small fraction of what was clearly an enormous, sophisticated body of ancient philosophical and literary work. For every single scroll that survived, however severely damaged, at Herculaneum, uncounted thousands of other ancient texts from other libraries, other cities, other civilizations, entirely, simply vanished without leaving behind any trace at all, destroyed by fire, war, flooding, or the simple, quiet passage of time with absolutely no volcanic ash to preserve even a fragmentary, carbonized shadow of what once existed. Every word that Vesuvius challenge researchers managed to successfully recover is not simply an interesting historical curiosity. It is a genuine physical rescue of human thought from what would otherwise have been permanent, total, and completely irreversible silence. That is precisely why researchers involved in this project consistently describe their work using language that borders on genuinely urgent, rather than simply academic or purely celebratory. Federica Nicolardi, a papyrologist at the University of Naples, who has worked closely with the Vesuvius Challenge team, has described the process of watching newly recovered text appear on screen as something bordering on disbelief, an experience she and her colleagues were, in her own words, completely amazed by. That reaction makes considerably more sense once you fully understand exactly what is actually happening in that moment. These are not simply words being translated. These are the actual, specific thoughts of a real individual human being who lived, wrote, and eventually died nearly 2,000 years ago. Thoughts that were fully expected to remain permanently, irretrievably lost, suddenly becoming legible again for the first time, since the exact moment that volcano erupted and silenced them completely. It is also worth understanding a bit more about who exactly Philodemus was, since his name keeps surfacing again and again throughout this entire project. And understanding him helps explain why these particular scrolls matter so much to historians in the first place. Philodemus was born around 110 BCE in Gadara, a city located in what is now modern-day Jordan, and he eventually traveled to Athens to study under a philosopher named Zeno of Sidon, who led the Epicurean school of philosophy at that time. Epicureanism itself is frequently misunderstood today, often reduced in popular imagination to a simple pursuit of indulgent physical pleasure. In reality, Epicurus and his followers, including Philodemus, developed a considerably more nuanced philosophical framework, one that valued careful, thoughtful moderation, close friendship, and the deliberate avoidance of unnecessary anxiety and pain as the true, sustainable path toward genuine long-term happiness and pleasure, rather than simply chasing short-term indulgence without any regard for consequence. Philodemus eventually settled in Herculaneum itself, likely serving as a resident philosopher and tutor for a wealthy Roman patron, possibly a member of the family who owned the extravagant villa of the papyri, where his personal library of scrolls was ultimately buried and preserved. Historians already suspected, based on the small number of scrolls scholars had managed to partially read using older and far more destructive physical unwrapping techniques centuries earlier, that Philodemus's own personal writings made up a significant portion of the villa's overall library collection. What the Vesuvius challenge has done is dramatically expand and deepen that existing understanding, revealing entire previously unknown works, confirming multi-book series that scholars had no earlier evidence for, and providing modern researchers with substantially more raw material than they have had access to in centuries, material that stands to meaningfully reshape academic understanding of Epicurean philosophy as it was actually practiced, discussed, and debated during the late Roman Republic and early Roman Empire. There is also a broader technological story worth appreciating here, one that extends well beyond just these specific Herculaneum scrolls. The core computer vision and machine learning techniques originally developed and refined specifically for this project, identifying incredibly subtle surface texture patterns invisible to the naked human eye, then using that data to reconstruct and virtually unroll a tightly wound, extremely fragile three-dimensional object, have genuine potential applications reaching well beyond ancient papyrus scrolls alone. Similar underlying approaches could eventually prove useful for reading other severely damaged historical documents, examining fragile medical specimens without physically disturbing them, or analyzing other delicate archaeological artifacts where any kind of direct physical handling risks causing irreversible damage. In that sense, the Vesuvius challenge represents something considerably larger than simply one remarkable archaeological achievement. It stands as a genuine proof of concept demonstrating that artificial intelligence, when carefully and thoughtfully applied to exactly the right kind of problem, can meaningfully recover information that honest, dedicated human experts had spent well over 2 centuries confidently declaring completely and permanently unrecoverable. The competition structure itself deserves some credit too for how quickly this entire field has managed to advance in such a remarkably short period of time. By offering substantial cash prizes for specific, clearly defined technical milestones, reading a certain number of characters, successfully identifying a scroll's title, and eventually reading an entire scroll completely from beginning to end, organizers created strong incentives that attracted a genuinely diverse, worldwide pool of technical talent, ranging from established computer vision researchers working at major universities all the way down to talented amateur programmers and curious undergraduate students working largely on their own initiative and personal curiosity. That open, genuinely collaborative structure, sharing scan data publicly and encouraging different teams and individuals to build directly upon each other's incremental technical progress, likely accelerated the pace of discovery considerably faster than a more traditional, closed, single-institution research project, working in isolation, ever realistically could have managed on its own. Is this precise combination of technological triumph paired directly against a sobering reminder of exactly how much of humanity's collective knowledge has already been permanently and irretrievably lost throughout history? Artificial intelligence did not simply help scholars read old text more conveniently or more efficiently. It managed to reach directly across 2,000 years of complete, total silence and pull actual human thoughts, genuine philosophical arguments, specific individual emotions like disgust and long-forgotten book titles and author names back into the light from documents that every single expert studying them had confidently declared permanently unreadable for well over 2 entire centuries. Hundreds of scrolls still remain sealed and completely unread even today, and potentially countless more still lie buried and undiscovered directly beneath the ancient volcanic rock at Herculaneum. Somewhere within all of that still largely unknown body of ancient human thought, quietly waiting for the technology and the researchers, finally capable of making it speak again.